contemporary suburban Chicago, a comfortable middle-class neighborhood where the yards are neat and the silence often hides secrets. Chapter 1. Cracks in the foundation. Mara stood at the kitchen sink, watching the condensation bead against the window pane. Outside, winter clung stubbornly to the branches. The morning was too quiet. Daniel hadn't come home last night. She stared at her phone on the granite counter. No messages, no missed calls. The clock blinked 6:37 a.m. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned off the faucet. She could still smell his cologne faintly on the coat draped over the dining room chair, a sour reminder that something had shifted. Daniel had never stayed out without calling, not in their 10 years of marriage. Their daughter, Ella, padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes. "Daddy's not home?" she asked, her voice small. Mara forced a smile. "He had a late meeting, baby. Go get dressed for school." Chapter 2. The Vanishing. Daniel arrived home around 7:15 a.m., tie loosened, eyes hollow. "You could have at least called," Mara said, her voice too calm. "I didn't want to wake you." He lied. "You weren't with Greg. I called him." A beat of silence. "I needed air," Daniel said, setting his keys down with deliberate care. "I slept in the car. We fought last night. I didn't want to come back angry." Her face barely moved. "Then tell me why you weren't answering." "Your phone." He looked at her like a man surveying the edges of a cliff. "I messed up." Chapter 3. The Other Woman. It took only a week for the truth to unspool, bit by bit, like thread from a jagged tear. Her name was Sabine, a colleague from Daniel's marketing firm. Young, eager, his assistant for the past year. The affair had been going on for months. Mara found the receipts in his glove box. A hotel in Oak Brook. 2 champagne flutes charged to the room. The timestamp. The same night Daniel had said he was at a client dinner. She didn't confront him that night. Instead, she took a walk around the block in the freezing cold. Every step felt like dragging a corpse. The corpse of her marriage. Chapter 4. Dissection. Mara made an appointment with her friend Jordan, a family law attorney. They met at a wine bar under the pretense of catching up, but the questions were sharp. "Do you think it's just physical?" Jordan asked. "I think I stopped being real to him a long time ago." Mara didn't tell Jordan about the envelope she'd received 2 days earlier, photos, printed from a cheap inkjet of Daniel and Sabine entering a hotel, exiting an Uber, laughing over drinks. No note, just the images. Someone had mailed them anonymously. She suspected Greg, Daniel's best friend, who'd been acting distant since the new year, or maybe Sabine herself. A power move. Chapter 5. Confession. Daniel sobbed. It was a quiet, private breakdown in the guest room where he'd been sleeping. "I didn't mean to fall for her," he said. "She listened to me. You haven't looked at me like that in years, Mara. I was drowning." She stared at him, arms crossed, voice cracking. "You think I wasn't drowning too?" There were moments in the weeks that followed when she considered keying his car, burning the photos, sending them to Sabine's fiancé. Yes, she'd learned Sabine was engaged, but the more she imagined revenge, the less it satisfied. Chapter 6. Ella. Their daughter became a quiet observer in their unraveling. Home. One night Mara overheard her talking to her doll. "Mommy's mad at Daddy because he lied. Daddy says sorry a lot. Children always know." That weekend, Mara sat Daniel down. "We need to tell her something. We can't let her live in confusion." "What? Do we tell her?" Daniel asked, voice brittle. "The truth. A version she can handle." Chapter 7. The Investigation. The anonymous envelope had lingered in Mara's thoughts. One night, after too many glasses of wine, she called Greg. "Was it you?" she asked. A long pause. "No," he said slowly. "But you should know. Sabine isn't just his mistake. She was promoted because she threatened to file a harassment complaint. She's done this before. HR buried it." Mara blinked. "So, she's what? A manipulator that makes Daniel innocent?" "No. It makes him stupid and vulnerable, but not evil." Chapter 8. The reckoning Mara confronted Sabine outside her office building. "I know who you are," Mara said calmly. Sabine narrowed her eyes. "Then you know it's not all his fault." "Maybe not, but he's my husband, and you're not special. You're just the excuse." Sabine tilted her head. "You don't look like someone who's staying." Mara smiled, tired and broken. "You don't look like someone who's going to last." Chapter 9. Fracture divorce papers. Sat unsigned for 2 weeks on the kitchen counter. They went to counseling, not out of hope, but obligation. There were long silences, accusations, weeping. Then, unexpectedly, one afternoon, Daniel said, "You don't have to forgive me." Mara looked up. "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm terrified of a life where I don't have to earn it back." Chapter 10. The open door spring arrived late that year. Mara took down the photos from their 10th anniversary, stored them in a box, taped it shut. She packed a suitcase. Just one. For a week away at her sister's cabin, as she zipped it closed, Daniel stood in the doorway. "Is this the end?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But it's not revenge, and it's not forgiveness. It's breathing." Epilogue. A quiet ruin. Ella's laughter echoed faintly in the background, chasing bubbles through the backyard. Daniel sat on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee, watching Mara return from her week away. She looked different. Not healed, but unburdened. They didn't rush to embrace. Just stood there, letting the silence say what words couldn't. There was no grand decision. No miracle of reconciliation. Just the wreckage and the quiet shared. Work of sorting through it, end. A quiet ruin is still a place to begin again. The house was quieter now. Not the uneasy silence of withheld truths, but the tentative quiet of two people relearning how to be near each other. They moved like strangers in a museum of their former life. Cautious, reverent, unsure what should be preserved and what needed to be dismantled. Mara kept her distance, physically and emotionally. Her week away had given her clarity, but not closure. She still found herself flinching when Daniel touched her shoulder, still caught her breath, when she passed the hotel on Madison Avenue. But she noticed small things. He made Ella's lunch every morning without being asked. He stopped drinking. He left his phone out, face up, on the kitchen counter. These weren't grand gestures. They were signals. Proof he was trying, even if he didn't always know how. They began talking again. Not about the affair, not directly, but about the years before it. The nights he worked late, the things they didn't say after her miscarriage 3 years ago, the intimacy that quietly drained from their marriage like water from a cracked vase. "I think I hated you a little," Mara admitted one night, sitting across from him at the dinner table. Daniel didn't flinch. "I hated myself, but I didn't know how to stop needing someone to see me. And I didn't know how to reach you," she said softly. "So I stopped trying." Chapter 12. The Other. Truth. One afternoon, Mara returned from the grocery store to find a manila envelope tucked under her doormat. Inside, a flash drive. She closed the curtains before opening her laptop. The video was grainy, from a security camera time-stamped 2 months ago. Sabine outside Daniel's car. She was crying, screaming, actually. He looked angry. He shoved her hand away when she reached for him. She slapped him. Mara leaned closer. There were no kisses, no touching, no trace of affection. She stared at the paused frame. The betrayal hadn't been as clean-cut as she'd believed. He had ended it, publicly, angrily. Someone had recorded it and sent it to her. She didn't know who. Maybe Greg. Maybe Sabine's fiancé. Maybe Sabine herself. But it changed something. That night, she didn't bring it up. She just lay beside Daniel for the first time in months, her back to him, their shoulders nearly touching. Chapter 13. Gray. They attended a birthday party for Ella's friend 2 Saturdays later. It was a crowded backyard, sticky with late spring humidity, dotted with conversations and forced laughter. Daniel stayed close to Mara, but not possessively, tentatively, as though afraid to assume he had that right again. Later, as they helped Ella into bed, Mara watched him brush their daughter's hair, his fingers gentle, his smile real. Not a performance, not guilt. Something closer to humility. After Ella fell asleep, Mara asked him a question she hadn't dared before. "If I hadn't found out, would you have told me?" Daniel hesitated. "I like to think I would have, but maybe not until it was too late." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the truth. Chapter 14. The visit Sabine came by the house in early June. Mara opened the door and stared at her. She looked less dangerous now, paler, nervous. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," Sabine said quickly. "Not for what happened, because I know that sounds hollow, but for hurting you and your daughter." "You're not here for closure," Mara said. "You're here for relief." Sabine opened her mouth, then closed it. "You want me to say something that makes it easier for you to sleep at night, but I don't owe you that." Sabine nodded. "I know." Mara shut the door without another word. Chapter 15. Uneven ground. A month passed. Then 2. They weren't back to normal, but there was a rhythm now. Some mornings they laughed over burnt toast. Some nights they sat on opposite ends of the couch, the air thick with unspoken things. But they were still there. And that counted for something. One night, Daniel asked, "Do you think we'll ever be okay?" Mara didn't answer right away. "I think we might be," she finally said. "But it'll be a different version of us. Something rebuilt, not restored. And if we're not, then at least we tried. Honestly this time." Epilogue. The therapist's office was warm, sunlit, scattered with children's drawings, and fading paperbacks. It was their 7th session. "I don't need you to promise me forever," Mara said quietly, looking past Daniel to the bookshelf. "I just need you to show up, every day, even if we're both still angry." Daniel looked at her, his face older, humbled. "I can do that," he said. Outside, the first leaves of autumn began to fall. Their future wasn't certain, but it was theirs again, fragile, flawed, and still in motion. And sometimes forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a long walk on uneven ground. Autumn deepened, and with it came a shift that neither Mara nor Daniel could quite define. The air in their home carried less static. The wounds hadn't closed, but they weren't as raw. Ella began asking questions. Not direct ones, she was too young for that, but curious, perceptive things. "Why do you and Daddy talk so quiet now? Why didn't you come to the last play at school, Mommy? Did I do something wrong?" Mara had to choke down. The answers she couldn't give. She knew children absorb silence more than they ever absorb the words adults craft carefully around it. One evening, Mara sat Ella down on the back porch and said, "Sometimes adults hurt each other. Not because of you. Not because they don't love you. But because they forget how to say what they need." Ella blinked at her, chewing the corner of a graham cracker. Like when I don't ask for help with math and then cry about it later? Mara smiled through tears. Exactly like that. Chapter 17. Ashes and Paper Mara began writing again. She had stopped for years, after Ella was born, after the miscarriage, after Daniel became a stranger with a ring on his finger. But something inside her had shifted. She wrote not about them, but about characters who lied and flailed and forgave too late. It wasn't cathartic. It was honest. Daniel found one of her drafts open on the dining table. He didn't read it. Just stood over it like someone staring into a fire they couldn't walk through. Later that night, he said, "You should publish it." Mara shook her head. "It's not for that." "What's it for?" "So I remember." Chapter 18. A knock in the night one night in early November, while Mara was at the grocery store and Ella was at a sleepover. Daniel opened the front door to find a man waiting. It was Sabine's fiancé, ex-fiancé, Greg. He looked different now. Thinner, twitchier. A man who had lived through shame and come out rougher. "I thought you should know," he said, handing Daniel a sealed envelope. "Sabine filed a complaint. Said you harassed her after she ended it." Daniel stiffened. "What?" "She won't push it. Not unless she thinks you're telling people about her. But if you want my advice, stay clean. Keep your head down." Greg paused, then added, "We all got burned, but only some of us deserve it." He walked away without another word. Daniel didn't tell Mara about the envelope. Not right away. That night, he stayed up late, rereading every message he had ever sent Sabine, watching the line between truth and threat blur like chalk in rain. Chapter 19. Choices. Thanksgiving came. They hosted it for the first time in 3 years. Just close friends, Mara's sister, a neighbor with no family. Daniel carved the turkey. Mara poured wine with steady hands, and at the end of the night, after everyone left and the dishes were stacked in the sink, Daniel said, "There's something you need to know." He told her about Greg, the complaint, the envelope. Mara stared at him, unreadable. "Why now?" "Because lying again would kill everything we've tried to rebuild, even if it protects us in the short term." She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just sat down slowly, like the floor had shifted beneath her. "I don't know if I can keep forgiving," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "I'm not asking for that anymore. Just truth. From here on out." Chapter 20. Somewhere between winter came like a whisper. No big storms. Just the quieting of trees and light, the world shrinking into homes and habits. Mara and Daniel settled into a rhythm. Not like before, but something new. Tentative. There were still nights Mara couldn't sleep. Still moments Daniel couldn't meet her eyes. But they didn't run anymore. When Mara's first story was published in a small online journal, she left the page open on the laptop. Not by accident. Daniel read it at midnight. The final line stayed. "With him long after. Love, even broken, is still a mirror. We flinch only because it shows us everything." Final scene. The future. Unwritten. One night, weeks before the new year, they stood outside in the backyard as Ella twirled in circles with a sparkler. Mara watched the light trace glowing shapes in the dark. Daniel stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Do you ever think we made the wrong choice, staying?" she asked. Daniel looked at her. "Every day. And every day I still stay." She didn't smile, but she didn't walk away either. Instead, she whispered, "Me too." They watched Ella's laughter float into the cold, the last of the sparks fading into smoke. Their story wasn't healed, but it was still being written. End. A marriage can survive betrayal, but it never survives unchanged. Sometimes the strongest love is the one willing to live beside the cracks. Spring thawed the edges of winter slowly that year, as though the world wasn't ready to forgive either. Mara stood in the attic one morning, sorting through boxes of books and old baby clothes. Dust motes floated lazily in the sunlight filtering through the round window. She opened a long-forgotten box labeled D+M 2009-2012. Inside were photos, cards, and a journal she hadn't remembered keeping. The journal was filled with fragments, half-thoughts scribbled during late nights and early mornings. Daniel kissed the top of my head before work. I pretended I was still asleep. I don't. Think he sees me anymore? We used to be people who dreamed out loud. Mara closed the book and set it aside, not to throw away, not yet. Some echoes were worth preserving. A new door downstairs, Daniel brewed coffee. He glanced up as Mara entered, her face unreadable. I found our old photos, she said. The ones from before Ella. Before everything. He gestured to the kitchen. Table. Sit. Tell me what you remember. So she did. Not everything, but some things. He listened. Not as someone seeking absolution, but as a man willing to carry part of the weight now. There were still silences, still unspoken resentments that pulsed below certain conversations like dormant fault lines. But there was also something new, a willingness to confront them before they split open. They began attending therapy, not for closure but for clarity, not to stitch up what had torn, but to understand the fabric better. Shadows from the past Sabine didn't come back. Not directly. But Mara received an anonymous tip through a literary contact. Someone had submitted a story under a pseudonym that bore striking resemblance to their saga. Mara read it. Every word. It was vicious, skewed. Daniel was painted as a manipulative man who gaslighted his mistress, while Mara became a self-righteous wife clinging to moral superiority. She considered suing. But instead, she printed the story and left it on Daniel's desk with a note. Even our mistakes become someone else's story. Doesn't make them true. He read it that night and never spoke of it again. Some ghosts don't need exercising. Just acknowledgement. As Ella grew, she asked more complex questions. Not about the affair, but about love, loss, loyalty. Is it okay to stay mad at someone you love? Can two people both be wrong and still stay together? What if one day I don't want to get married? Mara and Daniel answered carefully, not because they feared the truth, but because they'd come to respect its weight. Ella remained the bridge neither of them would ever willingly burn. Final moments on their anniversary, technically still valid. Though neither had celebrated it in years, Daniel brought home a small potted bonsai. It wasn't flowers or jewelry, just something that would take patience and care. Mara raised an eyebrow. He said, "Thought we could try keeping something alive together again." She didn't answer, just watered it quietly, then placed it in the sunroom. Closing, linesome betrayals shatter. Others reveal fractures that were already there. What Mara and Daniel rebuilt wasn't perfect. It wasn't romantic, but it was real. Tended like a garden that had once been overrun and nearly left for dead. Time would tell whether it bloomed, but for now, there was light and breath and the sound of two people learning to stay, not because they must, but because they choose. To every day they opened a new door and let the past walk beside them, not behind, not ahead, just close enough to remember, but not close enough to lead. End. A marriage rebuilt is not a return to the beginning. It is a new road, paved over, ruins, edged with honesty and lined with the choice to keep walking, even if the path is no longer straight. It had survived a sweltering summer, 2 missed waterings, and a leaf blight Mara noticed too late. She sat with it on the sunroom table, fingertips brushing its brittle branches. There was no dramatic symbolism in it. Things die, even when you try. Daniel found her there after his run, sweat-drenched and quiet. He didn't ask if she was okay. They didn't speak in metaphors anymore. Instead, he fetched a small shovel and an old clay pot from the shed. He knelt beside her, dug out the hardened soil and turned it over with compost. "What should we plant instead?" he asked. Mara looked out the window. "Something that blooms late." They chose a camellia, soft pink, winter blooming, a flower that knew how to survive cold, change, and stillness. They no longer spoke of Sabine, but she lived in the seams of their marriage like a story they had both agreed not to reread aloud. The book remained shelved but not forgotten. Daniel had changed jobs, moved into consulting, less late-night travel, less need for alibis, more dinners at home, more silences. That weren't punishment. Mara had started teaching part-time creative writing. Her students were bright-eyed and hungry. Some reminded her of Sabine. Some reminded her of herself once. She wrote again. Nothing dramatic. Quiet pieces, observations about the ordinary courage it takes to remain after betrayal, to remain yourself. Sometimes Daniel read them. Sometimes he didn't. And that was okay, too. Ella's secret one Saturday, Ella came home with a troubled look. She was 14 now, full of questions, rolling eyes, and the quiet storm of adolescence. She waited until after dinner to ask, "Did you ever want to leave each other?" Daniel set down his fork. Mara's wine glass tilted in her hand. "Yes," Mara said finally, "more than once. But you didn't." "No," Daniel said, "we didn't." "Why not?" Mara looked at her daughter. "Because forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering and deciding to keep going anyway." Ella nodded slowly, chewing on the words like gristle. Then she added, "I'm glad you stayed, but if you didn't, I think I'd still be okay." The weight of that, her growing independence, settled over them like dusk. She was learning not just from what they said, but from what they chose not to say. An unexpected letter. On a drizzly morning in March, Mara received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet. I used to think we could rewrite the ending. But maybe some stories are better as warnings, not blueprints. Thank you for showing me grace, even when I didn't deserve it. I've started over, somewhere colder. It's helping. Smara folded it quietly and placed it in a drawer beneath her scarves. She didn't tell Daniel. Some truths lived best in private compartments. At the threshold, by the following spring, the camellia bloomed. One flower, hesitant and pink, pushed through the gray. Daniel stood beside it one morning, coffee in hand. "She made it," he said. Mara joined him in the doorway, arms crossed against the wind. Barely. He turned to her, not with certainty, but a question that sounded like a prayer. "Are we?" She didn't answer with words, just stepped closer, placed a hand on his chest, and rested her forehead against his shoulder. It wasn't surrender. It was presence. And sometimes that was more honest than promises. Final note. There were still days where memory bit like frost, where glances held old shadows, where doubt whispered. But they had stopped treating marriage like a sentence and started seeing it as a dialogue, flawed, ongoing, unfinished. And so they stayed, not in the ruins, not in denial, but in something else entirely. Call it reconciliation, call it survival, call it love. Whatever it was, it had roots now, and it was learning how to bloom. Even in winter. End. Some betrayals end things. Others begin something harder, the work of rebuilding what still wants to live. The camellia bush stood tall now, a few feet higher, with branches curling toward the sunlight that filtered through the back porch. Its blooms had deepened in color. blush giving way to crimson. Mara sometimes joked that it had grown more confident than she had. Ella was 19. She had chosen to attend a university a few hours away, close enough for weekend visits, far enough to carve out the distance she sometimes needed. She was studying psychology and creative writing, an echo of her parents in equal measure. One Sunday afternoon, she came home with a question. "Can I write about what happened?" she asked over coffee. The kind of question that didn't need specifics. Everyone in the family knew what happened meant. Daniel looked up from his paper, unsure how to answer. Mara watched Ella's face, calm but intent. "Why?" Mara asked gently. Ella shrugged. "Because it's in me. Like a scar I didn't earn but still carry." Daniel set his mug down. "Do you blame us?" "No," Ella said, "but I think I need to understand it." Mara reached out and touched her daughter's hand, warm and still smaller than her own. "Then tell the truth. But know, your truth will always be different from ours." Ella's version. That summer, Ella wrote a short story titled The House That Wasn't Haunted. It told of a girl who grew up in a home where no one raised their voices, yet every corner whispered secrets, where her parents' silence was sometimes louder than fights would have been. She didn't name them, but it was unmistakably about Mara and Daniel. When she submitted it to her workshop, the professor marked one paragraph with a note. "This isn't a story about betrayal. It's a story about survival, both of the girl and the house." Ella kept that note taped above her desk. She never showed it to her parents, but Mara found a draft one weekend, tucked into the back of a notebook. Ella left on the piano. She read it without guilt. She read it with pride. Then she put it back exactly as it was. Sometimes a parent's love is letting your child shape your brokenness into something whole, echoes and edges. Daniel had learned slowly how to hold space for what he'd done without turning it into a constant act of self-punishment. He still bore the weight, but he'd stopped dragging it like a corpse. He and Mara were still married. Not because they'd clung to the past, but because they'd reinvented the present. They traveled more now, sometimes together, sometimes apart. Daniel once spent a month teaching in Kyoto. Mara took a solo retreat to a coastal cabin and wrote about loss and firewood and the small grace of boiling tea on a cold morning. They didn't check in constantly, but they came back, to each other, to the quiet house where something new had grown. Final glimpse. One evening in early autumn, Mara stood at the window as leaves danced along the garden path. Daniel came in behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. They didn't speak. The silence was no longer hollow. It was shared. Outside, the camellia bush swayed in the wind, petals loosening and drifting, some falling to the soil, others carried farther than they were ever meant to go. Not every bloom stayed, not every scar faded, but some things, love, forgiveness, resilience, endured, even if imperfectly, even if only just the end. A legacy isn't always what you leave behind. It's what you live through together. Broken things can still hold light if they're held carefully enough. Mara's hair had silvered, not in streaks, but in quiet waves that framed her face like fog over calm water. She wore it shorter now, practical, still elegant, the kind of look that suited someone who had shed everything unnecessary in favor of what endures. Daniel had retired early. The consulting world had grown too sharp, too fast. He spent mornings woodworking in the garage, afternoons reading, evenings beside her. They had settled into a rhythm less like a dance, and more like breath, sometimes in sync, sometimes slightly staggered, but always returning. They lived in the same house. The camellia had become a small tree, now supported by a brace they installed. After a storm bent its trunk, Mara never replaced the bonsai. She didn't need to anymore. One afternoon, while dusting the bookshelf, Mara found something unexpected. A black, hard-bound notebook she hadn't seen in years. It was Ella's, left behind from a visit months ago. On the first page was a handwritten dedication to the ones who stayed, and to the silence that taught me to listen. It was a manuscript, a novel, unpublished, but finished. Title: The Echo Room, the daughter's story. The book followed a woman named Lila, raised in a house of silence, lies, and too polite dinners. Her parents had stayed married through an affair that had nearly destroyed them, and Lila had grown up balancing between admiration and quiet resentment. As an adult, Lila investigated emotional hauntings, not ghosts, but the echoes of trauma, betrayal, and unspoken grief that lingered in people's homes. The story walked the line between realism and metaphor. The past appeared as flickers in mirrors, whispers in stairwells, a sense that something was always just out of frame. Toward the end, Lila returned to her childhood home after her mother's death. Her father, still living there, had let the garden grow wild. The camellia bush had collapsed under its own weight. In the final chapter, Lila unearthed a box of letters, never sent, from her mother to the woman her father had once loved. "I don't hate you, but I needed you to know you didn't win. Not because I kept him, but because I stayed myself." Mara closed the manuscript and sat for a long time in the quiet. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Ella. The call, "Hello?" Ella's voice was tired, soft. "I read your novel," Mara said. There was a pause. "I didn't think you'd find it." "I didn't finish it," Mara replied. Another pause. "Why not?" "Because I don't need to. I lived most of it." Ella exhaled. "Was it fair?" Mara smiled. "Fairness is for courtrooms. What you wrote was true. Maybe not always factually, but emotionally? Yes, they sat in that truth together, even separated by distance." "Mom," Ella said, her voice cracking slightly, "did you ever think I would grow up damaged? Because of everything?" Mara's answer came gently. "I think you grew up aware, and that's harder, but it made you honest and brave." Ella didn't speak for a moment. Then, "I'm pregnant." Mara closed her eyes, breath catching. "You're going to be a mother." "Yeah. Does he know?" "He cried when I told him. In the good way." Mara could hear the smile in her daughter's voice, tentative and full of light. "I want to do it differently," Ella said. "You will," Mara replied. "Not because we failed, but because you learned where the cracks were." Final scene. Months later, Mara held her grandchild, Noah, in her arms. The baby had Daniel's eyes, Ella's calm. Outside the window, the camellia tree had finally been cut down. The storm the previous winter had split its trunk beyond saving. Daniel planned to use the wood for a rocking chair. When Ella came into the room, Mara looked up at her. "You know what I've been thinking?" Mara asked. Ella smiled. "That depends. We didn't survive that time because we knew how to fix things. We survived because we eventually stopped lying to ourselves." Ella nodded. "You stopped pretending, and we let ourselves be human." Outside, a new garden was taking shape. Not just pruned, reimagined, with native plants, pollinators, and one newly planted sapling that Ella had chosen, a red maple. It wouldn't bloom until autumn, but its roots were already taking hold. End. Some echoes fade. Others grow into songs your children learn by heart, transforming history into harmony 30 years later. What We Inherit. Narrated by Noah. The attic smelled like cedar and thyme. I found the box while looking for an old photo of my mom, the one where she's barefoot in a sundress, holding me at the beach. Instead, I found envelopes. Letters. A small wooden camellia carved with incredible detail. Inside it, a folded note in faded ink. To Noah. This tree once bloomed in the middle of everything we broke, and still found a way to be beautiful. When you wonder what to do with pain, remember this. Grandma Mara, I'd never met her. She died before I turned 3. But I knew her through Ella, my mother, and through the spaces she left behind. The humming stillness of the garden, the old maple, the stories my mother only told when the house was dark and quiet, the legacy of shadows. I grew up in a house where nothing was hidden, and yet not everything was said. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. Mom believed in speaking the truth, but she also believed in the weight of words, in their ability to bruise. Her partner, Sam, my other mom, was quieter. She taught me to read body language the way others read maps. I learned that love could look like arguing gently at midnight or like sitting in the driveway for 10 minutes in silence after a hard day. But I also knew the story. The one Ella had lived. The betrayal. The aftermath. The man who stayed. My grandfather Daniel had visited often when I was younger. After Grandma Mara passed, he moved to a small place by the sea, and sometimes I stayed with him during school breaks. It was there that I asked him, when I was 16, about her, the other woman. His answer? Some decisions cut deeper the older you get. But the worst part wasn't what I did. It was believing I'd already lost Mara before I did it. Then he looked at me and said, "Don't be the person who gives up on someone just because they're hurting." That stuck. The heirloom chair when he died. He left me the rocking chair he'd built from the camellia tree. It creaked a little when you leaned too far back, and its arms were worn smooth. There was a tiny engraving on the underside. Every scar is a shape of survival. I placed the chair in my apartment near the window where the light caught it best. When I had hard days, I sat there with tea and let silence wrap around me like a second skin. I thought about pain, about resilience, about how messy love is, and how powerful forgiveness can be when it's earned, not assumed. A new story, I'm a therapist now. I specialize in couples, especially those caught in cycles of silence or betrayal. People often ask how I understand so much. I never tell them. Everything. I just say I come from a long line of people who chose to stay after they almost didn't. Sometimes I write like my mom did. Short essays, vignettes. One was recently published in a small literary journal. It was titled The Garden After the Fire. It ends like this. What we inherit isn't always blood or belongings. Sometimes it's the ache in our bones when someone walks away. Sometimes it's the way we learn to stay, not blindly but bravely. To choose the broken thing again and again until it becomes something else, something better, not perfect, just real. Final moment one evening, I held my daughter, Leah, against my chest in the same camellia chair. She was only a few weeks old. The sky outside was soft with clouds and the wind tapped gently at the glass. I looked at her tiny face, asleep and unknowing. And I whispered, "You're going to grow up in a family that came from fire. But don't be afraid. We're good with ashes. We know how to build from them." End. Because sometimes, the most important thing we pass down isn't our story, it's our strength. Sam had passed 5 years ago. Cancer, swift and cruel. Noah lived a few towns away now with a family of her own. And Daniel, he was long gone, but sometimes she swore she could still hear the gentle rhythm of his knuckles tapping on her old kitchen table, the way he did when he was unsure of something but wanted to appear confident. Ella stood at the edge of the garden, the wind threading through her silver-streaked curls. The camellia tree had grown tall and elegant, blossoms bursting, in defiance of the approaching winter. She reached out and touched its bark with reverence, remembering her mother, the weight of pain, and how it had once seemed impossible to survive what had happened. And yet, she had. It had taken years to unlearn the reflex to hold back. Longer, still to speak without anger as her default armor. But the truth was, Mara's betrayal hadn't destroyed Ella. It had carved her open, made room for depth, for empathy, for something she hadn't known how to access before. Forgiveness hadn't come all at once. It had arrived in fragments. A letter, a call, a visit. The soft way Mara had eventually said, "I don't expect you to say anything. I just wanted you to see that I never stopped loving you." And she hadn't. Even through the shame. Even through the failed attempt at separation that turned into tentative cohabitation, then counseling, then an unexpected rediscovery of who they were beyond the trauma. Their reconciliation wasn't cinematic. It was daily, gritty work. Late-night arguments followed by early morning apologies. The years of unspoken grief slowly replaced with the language of care. Mara had died with Ella's hand in hers. That had been enough. Now, with the sun sinking below the hedge line, Ella sat in the same weathered rocking chair Noah had left behind during her last move. A faint creak, the scent of camellias, a cup of chamomile on the armrest. She opened the notebook she kept by her, sighed and wrote a single line. "We survived the storm, not because we were unbreakable, but because we chose again and again to repair what we could and to live with what we couldn't." She closed it gently. From inside, the phone rang. Once, then silence. No urgency. No dread. Just life. Carrying on. Bittersweet ending. The past remained like layers of paint beneath the present. Imperfect. Beautiful. And while Ella would never claim that healing meant forgetting, she had learned to live fully in the shadow and the sun. Love, she'd come to realize, was not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep choosing someone, even when the choosing cost something. Found in her handwriting, tucked inside the camellia carving, for Ella, for Noah, for anyone who ever wonders if I truly regretted it. I used to think guilt was the same as shame, that if you carried it long enough, it turned into understanding. I was wrong. Guilt is the echo of a choice you'd undo if given the chance. Shame is believing you are only that choice. I lived with both. The night I betrayed Daniel. No, the nights, because betrayal isn't always one moment. I told myself I was breaking something that had already cracked. I told myself I deserved more. And maybe I did. But I never stopped loving him, and I never stopped loving you, Ella. You were the only thing in my life I never doubted, even when you looked at me with eyes that had forgotten how to trust. That hurt more than any consequence I faced. You asked me once years later if I would have done it all again, if I could go back, knowing the pain I caused. I didn't answer then. I was afraid. But I will answer now. No, I wouldn't do it again. Not because I didn't love Claire or because what we had was nothing, but because I didn't understand the cost. I thought truth meant freedom, but sometimes it's just a torch that burns the people closest to you. You and I, Ella, we found our way back, but I know parts of you were never quite the same, and that is a grief I carry like a second heartbeat. Still, you let me love you again. You let me stay. And in the final stretch of my life, I have lived inside that grace. I have learned what real forgiveness feels like. Not clean, not easy, but alive. Daniel forgave me in his own way. I saw it in the way he looked at me at Noah's wedding. He wasn't mine anymore. But he didn't hate me. That was a mercy I never deserved but received anyway. Noah. Oh, my sweet girl. You carry us forward. You see people in ways I never could. You understand that love and pain come hand in hand. I only hope my mistakes have given you the map I never had. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. Or close. That's okay. I have made peace. The camellia blooms still. That's enough. With everything I have left. Mara final image. A worn page folded delicately into a camellia carving. A daughter holding it in her hands, light catching her tear-lined cheek. The garden behind her blooming fiercely into spring. No easy answers, but a legacy reshaped. An unpublished letter found among his belongings. I never imagined I'd live long enough to write this letter, or that I'd need to explain the man I was, beyond the mistakes that defined me in everyone else's eyes. When I first met Mara, I thought I had found something unbreakable. The kind of love that anchors you, the kind that makes the noise outside fade until all you hear is the rhythm of her breath beside you. I was young, foolish, certain that devotion was a guarantee. But life doesn't promise forever. It only gives us the days we're given, and sometimes those days test us in ways we can't predict. I betrayed Mara. That's the truth I carry like a stone in my chest. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I was lost. Drowning in silence, ashamed to admit my own failures, desperate for connection where I shouldn't have looked. Mara and I tried to rebuild after the fracture, and in many ways, we succeeded. The years were hard. Therapy, tears, nights spent questioning if we'd ever find each other again. But what I learned most was this. Forgiveness is not a destination. It's a practice. A daily choice to remember why you loved someone in the first place. Ella, our daughter. She is the light that kept me anchored when I wanted to drift away. Watching her grow, seeing her wrestle with her own shadows, reminded me that love isn't about perfection. It's about presence. If I could speak to the younger man I was, I'd tell him to hold Mara tighter, to speak louder when things were breaking, to never assume silence meant peace. But regrets are the lessons life forces upon us. I am grateful for the time I had with Mara, for the chance to grow, to heal, and to witness the strength of our family, not despite the betrayal, but through it. Because sometimes the greatest love stories are those that survive the darkest storms. With this letter, I leave you the hope that even when love is flawed and fractured, it can still endure, reshaped, but never destroyed. Daniel, the present moment. Ella folded the letter carefully, feeling the weight of her father's words settle around her like a quiet forgiveness she hadn't known she needed. The garden. Outside glowed with early morning light, the camellia tree casting soft shadows on the ground. She whispered softly to herself, "We are all more than our mistakes." And somewhere deep inside, she felt the fragile pulse of hope. Late afternoon, in Ella's sunlit living room, Noah sat cross-legged on the worn rug, sketchbook balanced on her knees. Her pencil moved steadily, capturing the delicate curve of a camellia blossom. Ella watched her daughter quietly from the armchair, the same one Mara had once loved. "Mom," Noah said without looking up, "do you think people can really change? Like, really change?" Ella's throat tightened. She folded her hands in her lap, searching for the right words. "I want to believe. They can," she said slowly. "But sometimes change is messy. It's not about erasing the past, but learning to live with it differently." Noah's pencil paused mid-stroke. "I guess I'm scared that some things never go away, like the hurt or the lies." Ella nodded. "Me too. But I also think that forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't about forgetting or pretending nothing happened. It's about deciding you won't let the past steal your future." Noah smiled faintly, but there was a shadow behind her eyes. "I'm trying. For you. For myself." Ella stood and crossed the room, kneeling beside her daughter. She reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair behind Noah's ear. "You don't have to carry it all alone. None of us do. They sat together in silence, the room filled with soft afternoon light and the quiet strength of shared understanding. Outside, the camellia tree swayed gently in the breeze, a reminder that even after the harshest winters, new growth is possible. In his modest workshop, late evening, the scent of wood shavings mingled with the faint aroma of pine from the old cabinets Sam had built. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface of a chair leg, each groove a reminder of careful work, something steady, reliable, unlike the chaos that had filled his home for years. Sam sat down heavily, wiping sweat from his brow. His eyes drifted to a faded photograph pinned to the wall, a younger Ella and Mara, arms wrapped around each other, smiling with a lightness he hadn't seen in decades. He sighed, a sound heavy with regret and something else, hope, maybe, buried deep beneath the weight. Sam had loved Ella once, fiercely. Their marriage, though imperfect, was a place where trust lived in the small things. Morning coffee made just right, the sound of laughter echoing through the halls, promises whispered in the dark. But he knew now how fragile those promises could be. The betrayal had fractured more than his marriage. It had shaken the foundation of who he thought he was. For years, anger was his refuge, a shield against the heartbreak that threatened to consume him. Yet here he was, alone in his workshop, still crafting pieces of a life he wished he could fix. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ella stepped in quietly. "I didn't want to disturb you," she said. He looked up, surprised but glad to see her. "Ella," she smiled, a bit tired, but genuine. "I was thinking, maybe we could try to start over. Not the way things were, but something new, for the family." Sam's eyes searched hers, seeing the hope and the hesitation mingled together. "Maybe," he said slowly, "it's time we built something stronger. Not perfect, but real." Ella nodded, stepping closer. And in the quiet workshop filled with tools and memories, two people who had been broken began the slow, careful work of healing.